Thank you very much for coming to this talk. I'm very excited to share this talk. It's a new one that I built specifically for QCon. Before I sort of start, I want to talk about two significant experiences I had in my career very early on. So I've been working in technology for almost 20 years, and so this experience kind of happened just after the dot-com crash. Maybe some of you remember this. So I actually had a job coming out of university, and actually I lost that job before I even started because they shut their office down. That's how it was where I was growing up in Australia. And so it was kind of this sort of 2001, 2002 period where things were a little bit uncertain, with the whole dot-com bubble had sort of burst. And I had this experience working for a large company, I'll call it Enterprise A. And in Enterprise A, I was working on a healthcare platform. And this was kind of exciting because health tech is quite important. And it felt like something that we could actually build and release and make changes to sort of hospitals, to governments, to help people get access to a health tech platform. But as an engineer, I was spending 3 or 4 months on calls with San Francisco and India, going through 200-page specifications. You can imagine how fun that was as a developer. This healthcare platform had a 2-year project plan, so this was constantly being updated, but you could imagine this whole sort of plan and these people building this plan of trying to get a healthcare platform early to test, get it sort of regulated. It's a lot of work, but we weren't going to see first customer using this platform for 2 years, and so that's quite a long. Can you still hear me? Yeah, there we go. And what was interesting is that everyone had opinions in this, and if you've worked in technology, you have lots of people with opinions, right? There's a saying about hippos, the highest paid perspective. And obviously, this was kind of the age before Agile, and so we had a lot of different handoffs. So 200-page specifications written by product managers. We still had our build and release team who would frantically put together build candidates, if you can imagine what that was like, or if you worked in that environment, you know what that's like. And then, of course, that very rigorous QA intense phase where we have sort of stable builds, relatively stable builds, and intense testing. So that was a really interesting, life-forming moment that I'm lucky that I experienced very early in my career. Now, a couple of years later, after I left that enterprise, I ended up joining a startup. And this was kind of interesting because startups, at least in Australia, were quite rare. And here we were actually practicing a lot of the sort of extreme programming principles and practices. So we actually had a user researcher with us who was actually doing user testing back then, trying to test out new types of prototypes to understand what would be a lot more appealing to people. We actually released every 2 weeks. So this was before cloud. We released every 2 weeks. We prepared a candidate. We got it ready and actually put this out live. And then we actually tested to see how our sort of changes actually performed with users. We had monthly ideation settings. So we didn't have lots of people throwing ideas and backlogs of ideas. We all actually generated sort of ideas or hypotheses about what we think would actually have the biggest movement, being on sort of customer sign-up or customer conversion, and actually trying to test that out. And we as developers were doing the full lifecycle thing of actually doing production support as well. Now, these two contrasting experiences for me were really life-changing, because as an engineer, I'm sort of thinking about what environment do I thrive in the best? Where do I get this full cycle? Make sure that I'm actually working in sort of the environment I want to have. And this is the challenge that you will probably face when you're actually working with recruiting people or keeping people employed. Engineers today have the choice of going wherever they like. And so they're sort of implicitly thinking about, is this the culture I want to work in? And therefore, which of these two choices would you actually go with? Or which of the many choices will they go with? And you have an ability to influence this if you're a technical leader in your organizations by trying to shape this engineering culture. And over my sort of 20-year journey, I want to share some of those secrets with you. Now, as Cassie mentioned, we have these quests for secrets, and I'll be your guide today. So a little bit about my background. I've been working for about 20 years. I did consulting with ThoughtWorks for about 14 years, and then over the last 2.5 years, I was CTO and chief scientist for a challenger bank in N26, where I could put a lot of the sort of principles and practices we helped with a lot of clients into play, growing an organization from 50 people to about 370 over 2.5 years. And that wasn't by chance, because when you build engineering cultures, you have to be really deliberate about it. Now, I had those two life-changing experiences early on in my career, so I kind of understand what developers want or what engineers want to have. And your responsibility as leaders or managers is to sort of think about this environment. You don't need to manage engineers. Your value add is managing the environment so those engineers can do the best things that they can. And so these are some of the lessons that I want to share. If you're interested, I have a couple of other books, and I run a course for tech leadership and also a newsletter for leaders in tech. But today, I want to talk about the journey that we're going to be going on, and really I want to talk about why this is quite important and why you should actually care. Then we're going to look at these 3 secrets, and we'll look at maybe some of the pitfalls with where companies go wrong, and also what you can do for each of these items, and then also describe some specific things that you can take away and actually put this into practice. So let's start with the sort of why. Let's have a talk about why this is actually important. So if you've ever had to do hiring, you know it's really hard. Now, as a startup CTO in Germany, starting with 50 people, and we had to grow really rapidly, I knew that actually engineers have choices wherever they like. You know, every team that I've talked to in most companies are trying to hire somewhere, right? So ideas are not the problem in our industry. Our problems are actually being able to build something, to sustain it, and also to experiment. So ideas are cheap, implementation's a lot hard. And you know, we're all trying to hire, maybe we're trying to grow talent, which is also a great way, but we just don't have enough. So there's a big supply and demand problem in our sort of industry for engineering talent. And as I said, ideas are cheap and easy. You can brainstorm hundreds of ideas, but actually it's only 1 or 2 of those things that you'll actually be able to put into production and actually test. And so your responsibility is thinking about where does software belong and how do you help it sort of grow in your sort of company in a sustainable way. And that's where engineering culture matters. And this is where all of you as tech leaders have an ability to influence it, because your sort of ability to support this is what will matter when you're trying to actually hire people. And so we have, you know, the supply of sort of developers over here, and we have all these vacancies. And we're all competing almost with each other. And it's your responsibility to decide what sort of engineering culture you have so that you have the best chance of attracting the developers that you're looking for. So you get to craft, and this is one of the exciting things about technical leadership, you get to craft the culture that you want to have to attract similar people or people who want to work in that culture and experience that culture, and you have the ability to influence it. So it's a really exciting opportunity to have. So remember that everyone has not just 2 choices, but often 10 or 20 different choices about where they'd like to work. We work in a very global, connected, easily mobile industry, and it's my experience that, you know, if you're not sort of keeping this engineering culture, a competitor will probably hire your engineers away from you. And that's why this is one of the biggest, most important things you can think about as you're trying to cultivate the right culture in your sort of area. So let's talk about 3 specific secrets, because these are the things that you're here for. So we'll look at each of these different elements, and we'll look at each one one by one. So the first secret really is about the secret of making sure that you have impact. And what do I mean by impact? So if we look at this, I think there's 3 different elements of impact that I think make a difference to a strong engineering culture. The first one is that as an engineer, I want to have impact with the customers. I want to know that what I do is useful for the people that we're actually selling our products for. I also want to make sure that I see the outcome of what I'm actually achieving, and that I've actually got some satisfaction that I've solved a certain puzzle. We'll talk about each of these elements. Now, one of the interesting things I've seen with some customer impact stuff is, you know, some organizations set up developers to be very far away from customers. So maybe you have an army of user researchers, some product people in the middle, and in those poor organizations where you still get handed a 200-page specification, an engineer doesn't feel that connection with that customer, right? And so this is one big trap that happens in a lot of organizations. And it's kind of hard to unwind because you have to often work through organizational sort of hierarchies and different departments to actually move towards that. It's probably one of the reasons why we've moved towards a lot more of a cross-functional role and really trying to put that customer perspective as close to the developers as close as possible. So that's something that you should avoid if you're heading in this way, if you want to build a strong engineering culture. Another idea is this thing about feature factories, right? So I've seen a lot of organizations where you have backlogs for years, right? You don't want to be in that world. Engineers definitely don't want to be in that world. Just I asked you for. That's the feature factory, right? Engineers join software because they want to solve problems. They don't want to just implement code. They want to actually have a part in that process of taking a problem, trying to be part of that solution, and really think about what it is, the simplest way to solve that solution through maybe some coding application. But if they just have features to implement, that's no fun as an engineer. So that's something else to avoid. Another perspective is sometimes people get too solution-focused, right? So this happens when you have a lot of product managers building lots of ideas about what could be done. So you know that there's a customer need, but somebody has come up with that perfect solution about what needs to be done. There's no negotiation around it. And once again, engineers want to be part of this sort of problem-solving perspective. What about seeing the outcome? What are some pitfalls that a lot of companies go down here? Well, one is there's just too many handoffs. Right? So, product people are handing specifications off to developers are handing things off to testers are handing things off to poor SRE or DevOps people, and everyone's just continuing to work. So as a developer, I'm not getting to see whether I make good decisions because I don't see the downward implication of where I'm coming from. Once again, this is a really hard thing to solve because you kind of need to have an ability to influence the organizational structure. And so this is something that you really want to try to remove of too many handoffs. Another idea is slow feedback loops. And this is one of the reasons why I think things like cloud architectures, continuous delivery have really helped to improve that. When I worked in that enterprise with a 2-year project plan to get to a release, I was really frustrated as a developer because I want to see the value of what I'm actually doing come to life. When I worked in a startup where we're then releasing every 2 weeks, that's such a big step change from 2 years to 2 weeks because I actually can see this sort of feedback loop and I can see the things that I do have been adding value. So work on improving these feedback loops and try to remove these slow feedback loops. Another challenge which happens when you have an organization with a small set of developers and maybe lots of product people is that people are often allocated to different types of products or projects, right? And so developers are often sort of context switching one project to another. This happens very much in early stage startups because you're often very lean in your engineering team. But all this context switching means that a person who's working on something probably isn't getting feedback about what they built previously is good quality, actually solved a customer need, and they're maybe not really focusing on what the biggest value is. So be careful of some of these pitfalls. And then, engineers join engineering so that you can solve this really interesting puzzle, right? So, Martin Fowler just published an article about outcomes over outputs. I get asked a lot by business people, how do you measure the productivity of teams? Right? Do you use velocity? Do you use points? Oh, my team is getting more points than your team. That's a really bad measure because it's measuring output. And a lot of people who haven't been working in software don't really understand you can come up with a really simple solution. It may take a little bit more time, but it may be less work. And the hard bit is in thinking about how you approach the problem and how you solve this problem elegantly. But if your organization is measuring people by the number of tickets they complete, by the number of story points your team delivers, by the number of features you pump out, who knows if those features are actually having an outcome to desired outputs for your company or the customer growth or customer engagement. So really you want to sort of invert this and stop focusing on the outputs. These are just byproducts of our process. They're no real measure of what the outcome is that you have with that output. Another thing that I hear a lot, and I'm one of those people that I actually try to instigate some planning. So I actually don't think all plans are bad. But one of the difficult things is when people have put together a plan, they then want to stick to the plan that they've built, right? And good planning processes mean that you adapt. You know that you're going to get your plan wrong, but it gives you a basis of saying, how far are we off our mark? So I believe in estimation not because the estimates and the date matter, it's because it gives us a good idea about do we share the same assumptions and what assumptions are changing as we validate our work. And if you have organizations that are just simply saying, but you promised it by this certain date, you're not going to be building a really good sort of engineering culture. And one of the things that often happens if you're working in a feature factory focused on lots of work is this idea of just lack of celebration of feedback. So let's move on to the next task. Let's forget that we've actually achieved something really great And let's just move on to the next feature, the next sprint, the next iteration. So these are all things that you can avoid if you're focused on this. So the principle I use for this is really cultivating impact by reducing feedback loops. Now, what does that mean? What are some concrete examples of what you can do for this? When I first came into N26, it was interesting because we're a B2C bank, so like all of you could sign up as a customer, and our engineers could actually get closer to the customer. This is a little bit more difficult if you're on a B2B platform where you're selling to other companies who then sell on to end customers. But one of the practices I encourage our teams to do is actually go sit next to our customer services people, right? So they're in the same, well, they weren't actually in the same building, but they're in the same city. And it wasn't much effort to go over for an afternoon, listen to some calls, understand what problems that people are actually having. And I remember one time we had this activity called Get Stuff Done Days. So every 6 weeks, 2 days, people can choose what they do. A team went over to customer services. They sat with customer service people, listened to some calls. And an engineer went, I didn't realize this was a problem. I can fix this right now. And like literally in an afternoon, fixed a customer issue that was plaguing customer services, right? So the further away you are from customers, the harder it is. This is a practice of shadowing CS that you can have to make sure that developers get closer to customers, get quick feedback about how their software is actually progressing. Another thing, and this is one of the reasons why I think Agile has become really successful, is not because of big scaling methods like SAFe or whatever, it's because you get to deliver in small increments, right? So any large transition or migration project that you've ever worked on, and you're not actually delivering value in small increments, it's going to destin to fail, right? So we've learned this through smaller sprints, smaller iterations. Make sure you deliver small outcomes, because then we can use that to improve our plans. And as developers, you get really good feedback about whether or not you're actually building something that's useful. I've worked on teams that have released something into production after, say, a month, only to find out users don't use it. And so they could actually can the whole project rather than continue on with the plan because they've got real feedback around user sort of feedback. OKRs are a very controversial topic, and this is a whole other talk by itself. But one of my pet peeves with how OKRs are used is that they're often used by management through objectives, so management through metrics. Now, if you use OKRs well, what you should be doing is making sure that OKRs are used for aligning the organization and making sure that people understand, here is how my work contributes. So most companies should have some sort of company mission, a goal that they're trying to have. And every probably year or every 6 months, there's probably sort of large initiatives or themes that your company is focused on to maybe improve, right? So it's either maybe customer growth, stability, or sort of customer conversion or activity, right? But then when a developer is working on a task, it's hard sometimes to understand how is this linked to the bigger, broader picture. Right? And this is where I think an effective use of OKRs is really important, because it's helping connect this feature to some sort of initiative to the company mission. And once again, engineers want to have impact. They want to have purpose. They want to understand why they're working on something. And so OKRs, when done well, can actually have a very important effect on this. The other thing is really about accelerating release speed and frequency. So how many of you have read the book Accelerate? Very good. If you haven't, I highly recommend it. It comes from the research that has come from the State of DevOps report that has been running probably for the last 4 or 5 years. And they actually come up with some good metrics about how you do measure the productivity of an engineering organization. And one of them is really about this sort of speed to release. So, if you can release every 2 weeks, if you can release daily, hourly, or on demand, it's even better. But you can't just simply release really rapidly. You also need some counterbalancing metrics, like making sure when you release, you don't break everything. So there's also some things about like failure change on release, so that you're actually developing quality as well. But this is one of the biggest lessons learned from both continuous delivery and that book, which is the quicker that you accelerate this feedback loop, the better it is, and the better your engineering organization will be as a result. So if you're looking for a big lever, this is probably one of the biggest ones to start with. It's a hard one if you've got really long release cycles, but it's definitely worth it as well. So we looked at impact as one of the secrets. Let's talk about another one of these secrets. And this is really about choice. Engineers love choice, but maybe a little bit too much choice sometimes, right? So when developers disagree, they love arguing over about these abstract ideas. But choice is quite an important part because it's part of this sort of problem-solving perspective. So part of it is having some say and being able to say what the solution is. Having a say in how I work as an engineer, right? So I like to have a say about how I conduct my daily business. And then also degrees of freedom. Now, it's interesting because I don't say complete freedom, and we'll come back to this in a bit. So around solution choice, things to be careful of is when you're a large organization, it's tempting to say you have to use X framework, right? You get this the larger your organization is that you want to have some consistency across the organization, so it makes sense that everyone has to use this framework. But you have to be careful because that can sort of backfire because it's removing choice from developers. Often people, and you get this if you have a separate sort of architecting group, are making decisions, and then developers kind of get to just simply implement these decisions. And that's really no fun if you're an engineer. And you really want to make sure that engineers are involved early so that they're part of that process of choosing how they build particular solutions. And then if that output is particularly predetermined, right? So here are all the tasks that you have to implement for a particular feature. That's also not very great from an engineering perspective. In terms of how to work, one of the interesting things after working in agile environments for a very long time is I'm really non-prescriptive. So I'm not going to go to a team and say, you have to do stand-ups at 9 o'clock. Even though I wrote a book on retrospectives, I'm not going to say you have to do a retrospective every Friday. I don't believe in that. So if you have a single way of working across your entire organization, that's a big smell you want to watch out for. If you have prescriptive processes, and it's okay to have them at the start, but if you're not actually improving your processes and changing it, you're probably not actually living the agile values because you're not improving them, adapting them. And if you're optimizing for an individual, this is really hard because as an individual engineer, I might have my personal preferences. But as a leader and manager, you want to optimize for the team and for the organization, not for a particular individual. Right? So you have to be careful about sort of boundaries of freedom because one individual's choice might start to impact the productivity of your team. And degrees of freedom is hard because we want to give lots of choice. You hear this term about developer autonomy, giving them lots of power to sort of choose. But you have to be careful about heavyweight rules, and we're seeing a trend away from architecture sort of rules to more principles to help people understand what a good decision looks like in their environment. I think there is something about too much freedom, right? So to say you can make any choice, whatever you like, I've seen a lot of companies that say you can use whatever programming languages you like, and then end up with 20 programming languages when they have 10 developers. You can imagine how that's going to be maintenance-wise long-term. And there's an interesting balance between autonomy and alignment. So my autonomy can start to step onto somebody else's autonomy because I'm sort of making a choice that affects more than me. And so this is where you as a leader are trying to sort of find out the right boundaries of both aligned decision-making and autonomous decision-making. And if you don't really have a clear decision-making process, this is another thing that sort of fuzzies up the boundaries, is that as a person, you have a certain amount of decisions that you can make for yourself. But as soon as it starts to impact other people or other departments, your decision-making perhaps starts to become less impactful, right? You can give input, but you're maybe not the decision maker. And to help improve this, you have to sort of describe what those boundaries are for where you are. So the principle here is really cultivating choice by making the right thing easy to do, right? So if you want people to use a preferred framework, make it easy for them to adopt it. Make it valuable, right? So that's the interesting thing. If it's useful, people will come to it, and that's one of the principles you can use here. So the good thing here is you should automate the basics, right? This is one of the reasons we're seeing a lot of stuff around developer productivity tools. Internal teams that are really focused on building common libraries, not because everyone's going to be forced to use these libraries, but just because they've solved this problem and my team can benefit from that immediately. Scripts that sort of automatically bootstrap new environments, new projects, make it easy. These are examples of making the right thing easy to do that then help with, then building on the interesting choices. Using architectural principles over rules. So the 12-factor 12-factor architecture is a really good example of 12 simple things that you can explain that talk about sort of cloud native or cloud sort of friendly architectures, right? And so that's something we're seeing a lot with different types of companies that are starting to adopt architecture principles, is that your company is at a different stage, you're optimizing for a different problem, and these are things that you can help articulate. Make sure that you set up the goal and step out of the way. This is really hard, right? Because we're often, as developers, people who want to maybe come up with a solution for other people. But actually, if we really want to engage with people, what we should really be talking about is, here is the problem that needs to be solved. Here are the constraints of how we're trying to solve that problem. You want to give that to the team and give them the ability to actually problem solve that. And too many places start to sort of take away that choice by actually already predetermining the solution for those teams. And the best way that you can engage with developer choice is making sure that you're clear about what it is that needs solving, and also by what constraints should that solution be. And then to solve the decision-making boundary, be clear about your decision-making process. So for a decision that affects the entire organization, you might decide, rather than everyone has a democratic vote, everyone can give input. But actually, the choice will be made by a smaller group of people who are trying to balance out the needs of all these different teams and groups, right? This is okay. You don't have to give everyone absolute input or sort of choices for every decision that you make. You just need to be clear about where those boundaries are and what types of decisions you have. So I tend to think in terms of technical decisions about those things that a team affects, the things that affect sort of subpart of a product, and then things that are affecting the whole platform as well. And you want different levels of decision-making processes depending on how irreversible the decision is and how wide that impact will be when you actually make that decision. So we've looked at impact, we've looked at choice. What is the third secret? Let's have a look. So this one is really about improvement, right? So developers want to continually see things improve. I had a hard time thinking about specifically what this meant to me, but one is definitely about personal improvement, right? So as a developer, one of the common things that probably we all share is we want to learn, we want to grow, right? That's a key thing. But also, if I'm working for a company, I want to make sure that like our company is also improving, right? If we're working for Tesla, we want to see movement towards automated. And then the other thing is really about the good work environment, right? So engineers will often complain. And I think one of the good things about a good engineering management group is making sure that people's complaints get addressed, right? So engineers will often think about the things that they can't control, the things that are in the environment. And to create a good engineering culture, you want to see improvements in that environment as well. And I see that as the core responsibility of management. So some traps around each of these different areas is if you don't have any growth opportunities, engineers will leave your company. And it's a natural part of our process. You see this with startups, and you see this with companies who aren't growing. People will want a bigger role, more responsibility. And it's one of the challenges that you have as a leader is trying to find something that's challenging for this person, and sometimes that will be without across the boundaries of your company. They'll have to join another company in order to have that opportunity to really grow. Being careful about repetitive work. If something is repetitive, invest in automating it. Or if it's something that needs doing, rotate that role. So be careful about things that are just simply the same thing day in, day out, because people will get bored and engineers need new challenges all the time, so they feel that they're actually learning. Another thing that happens quite a lot is really a lack of feedback and support. A common thing I hear from engineers is, how have I been doing? Have I been growing? By the time that you get to like an annual performance review of some sort, there shouldn't be any surprises. And if there are, it's probably an indicator that your environment is not providing the right sort of feedback or support. So make sure that you address each of these things if you really want to help engineers grow. The other thing that can stop people is really this fear of failure. So if somebody makes a mistake and they get fired for it, how safe do you think that environment is for learning? Right? You need to think about what causes that and how to create safety when people do make mistakes. Because it's very rare it's a person that makes that mistake. It's more about the system that allowed that mistake to happen. And that's actually a leadership responsibility.
So remember that bored people will quit, and if you're not actually encouraging them to grow and finding opportunities to grow, they will leave you and they'll find some other place where they can actually do that. So what about traps to sort of steps to mission? Well, one of them is unclear priorities. It's something that I see a lot in different organizations, is that if you haven't actually gone into an organization and you have clear priorities, this is really confusing because you don't really understand how your work connects to the broader mission. Early on in my time at N26, I actually visited Spotify in New York and talked to one of their sort of senior directors. And it was really interesting because they've got 6 levels of prioritization. Like, that's crazy. But then if you think about it, Spotify is something like, I don't know, 3,000 or 5,000 people, right? And so once again, it's interesting because you have different hierarchies of prioritization, but it's very clear in the order of those priorities. So me as an individual, I know if I'm working on something and it's not the topmost priority, I can go point to the common source and say, hey, I think we should be working on this thing instead, so I know I'm actually helping the company move in the way that it's going, right? And so this is something that you can actually influence. Make sure that you re-emphasize this mission that people are doing, but also make sure that they can understand initiatives. So sometimes a mission can be too broad and abstract, right? Too much of a big leap. It's like, how do we know that we're moving to perhaps autonomous vehicles? And then you can help people understand, here is the initiative that's actually helping towards that, and this is why your task is actually helping move towards that task. So try to address this gap. Another thing that happens a lot is really intransparent information. So maybe you have priorities, but maybe they're stuck in Jira somewhere. Nobody likes Jira. And so one of your tasks is really to make sure that people understand where information is, how to pull that information so they get the best out of it, right? Now, traps around the work environment, things to avoid here is these sayings about that won't work here. You see this in very large organizations that aren't used to lots of change. Oh, we tried that and it was really painful, and no, that won't work here again, right? And so you need a supportive environment to try things out, because those things will sometimes fail, they'll be a bit painful, but actually you need that environment to say, well, we don't know if it's going to work out, but let's see if it actually improves the environment. If you wait for people to say, can I do this? This is a big indicator that people don't feel safe or they're not encouraged to improve their environment. So asking for permission, you really want people to ask for forgiveness, right? I tried out this thing, I'm sorry, I think I stuffed up. You want people to continually improve their environment. And then once again, this lack of feedback about what your company is actually doing to take in employee feedback. How many of you do something like Culture Amp, measuring what's going on in your company? It's about a third. So even when those Culture Amp surveys come out, how many of those people are actually taking that feedback in, and people are saying, we're doing these initiatives based on your feedback, right? Often management will be so busy just getting those things done, but they'll forget to connect their initiatives to the feedback that actually happened. And so make sure that you take in that feedback, but make sure that you act on it, and make that connection to where that feedback comes from, because it's going to be longer and people will forget, right? So the principle here is really cultivating improvements by making small changes easier. And this is something that all of you can actually influence, be it in your team, being it with another team member, or across your sort of organization. Some concrete ideas are really making sure that you take actions from retrospectives. It's my pet peeve. If we talk about this topic, it comes up again and again. Why does it keep coming up? Oh, we didn't do that action from last time. I'm sorry. Right? So making sure that people follow up on actions is one of your basic fundamentals, really. Making sure that you improve the system through postmortems. And I see this with not just incident postmortems, but also from project postmortems, right? So some large-scale project that maybe didn't go so well, you need to take the time out to actually reflect on what things did go well so you can amplify those things, and what things would you change the next time your organization takes on a large initiative. Right? And this takes time out because rather than working on the next item, you're really trying to focus on improving the system, and that's really worthwhile. Creating forums is an important part. So I don't believe in pushing everyone to work in the same way. What I do believe in is creating ways that people can pull advice from other people who faced similar scenarios. So be it your guilds of people with the same sort of functional skills, or be it at the end of an initiative, or some sort of brown bag or lunch and learn kind of learning session. You really need to be thinking about what environments you create to sort of amplify these so that people are aware, oh yeah, someone in my organization has already faced this problem and I know who to reach out to in order to understand how they approached it, right? So these are some of the things that you can actually do. And making sure that you define growth paths. You do this a lot in sort of early stage startups where people are just doing everything that they need to do to keep the business running, but then people will want to ask, how do I grow? What's my next step? What's my next challenge? Even in larger organizations, you may have these growth paths, but what you're trying to do is trying to help people find out how does it apply to them in their environment? What's the next opportunity based on what they want to grow in? So make sure that you talk about different growth paths and not just a management track, but really a sort of individual contributor track or a technical leadership track where people can stay technical and hands-on. That's a really strong indicator of a good engineering culture. So we've looked at these 3 secrets. Let's quickly talk about how you can actually take some action from this. So a very simple 5-step recipe. First step is make sure that you gather input. You talk to your existing organization. Like you have engineers in your team. You should listen to why those engineers are still working for you. There's probably some good reasons, right? So gather some input from those people. Publish your tech culture. So one of the interesting things about this is once you've talked to people, synthesize that information. What makes your environment different? Why do people come to choose to work for your company rather than somebody like a Google or an Amazon, right? And there's lots of great reasons. Maybe you get to work on a product that you'd never get a chance to work in a big giant. Perhaps you get to work in a much smaller sort of team so that you know everyone. That can be really important for people as well. But make sure you describe how you describe your tech culture to other people. Then think about prioritizing key improvement areas. So as you talk to people, there'll be definitely painful points which aren't so ideal. And here is where you want to actually talk about, okay, these are really good parts of our tech culture, but here are some areas where we should definitely improve as part of that. And then decide on actions as a leadership or a management group and make sure you follow them up, right? So if it's that people aren't getting feedback on a regular basis, find out a way to maybe make sure that they get feedback from peers on a monthly basis or something like that, right? Maybe people need feedback training, and so you have to actually decide how you're actually going to fulfill that to improve this engineering culture. And then it's as simple as repeating, right? So it's a 5-step simple recipe about how you can improve your engineering culture. And we all love metrics, we all love good questions. So here are some 3 simple questions you can use to ask yourself, are you building a strong engineering culture? How many handoffs do you have between software engineers and customers? And here's a hint, less is better. Are software engineers involved how they solve a business problem, or are they just simply implementing a business problem? And what opportunities do software engineers have to grow? And these 3 simple questions we can link back to simply asking 3 simple secrets about impact, choice, and improvement. So you all have an ability to improve your engineering culture regardless of where you are and where you want to actually get to. I hope that you have a better understanding about where these different elements are that you can influence. And remember that engineers have these choices. And so you have the ability to steer how they choose this by really focusing on improving your engineering culture so it becomes the appealing place for the types of people that you actually want to hire. Thank you very much, and I think we have some time for questions.
All right, we have about 10 minutes for questions, so if you guys want to line up along these microphones, that's probably the easiest way. But I'll start off with one question. So one of the second things that you said was publishing your tech culture, and so a tactical question around that is like, how do you publish it? Where does that get published? I'm assuming you're taking inputs from the engineers, but what does that look like if I'm going to do that tomorrow?
Yeah, so what I would say with sort of codifying your tech culture is starting to look at maybe other sources for inspiration. A lot of companies have sort of published their company handbook, right? So you can think about like the Valve handbook or Amazon's 12 principles of leadership. And you can use them as inspiration for thinking about how you want to codify your culture. I don't think there's a single correct place, so you might start by doing an internal blog post or something like that. But there are so many different ways that you can implement it that you kind of have your own choice about how you'd like to do this, right? But as you start to write your culture, don't write it and then publish it to the world. Publish it internally first. As you talk to people, as you try to work out what elements of your culture are unique, these are things to test out with your engineers, because if it doesn't resonate with them, then it won't really fit, right? They're not going to be supporters of it. And so this is one interesting thing about when I join a new company, or when I'm helping a new company, is I really try to listen to understand what makes that company unique, and every company is unique for a certain reason. So I'd start off with something simple like an internal blog post, maybe an internal sort of presentation or info deck, but just a simple way to sort of describe the company culture that is written down. So that would be the most important part.
Hi, thanks. Hi. I have a question about how to sort of, it would be interesting to hear your feedback on how to sort of facilitate, to get a culture of learning. Like currently sort of where I'm stuck, there's a lot of sort of, this is the way we do things because we've always done it that way. And I want to sort of try to attack that and to sort of break it down and to sort of, but people are fearful of change and of new technology, and I really don't understand why people are fearful of new technology, why they are in tech in general, because you should probably do something else. But it would be interesting to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you. I think there's a couple of things. So I don't believe in like making people do things. The things that I think, the levers that I think about are what stops them from taking part, and also what encourages them. So they're the two levers that I tend to think of, right? And so in terms of maybe what's stopping them, sometimes it's maybe too much work. That's a common thing. Engineers are often sort of feeling that they have to have that pressure to maybe building a new feature, to completing the things that their team has been sort of working on or what they've been allocated to. And so I think one thing is, as leaders, trying to make sure that there's sort of enough slack time or opportunities that people can sort of take part without feeling pressure from normal work. So I think if everyone's working at like 100% capacity of like functional work, they have no time for learning. And so as a leader, I'm sort of thinking about how do I create some time so that they can actually take part. So that might mean that you start off with lunch and learn, so you do a learning activity during lunchtime, incentivized by bringing in free food. Everyone loves free food. And then maybe try to make sure that you amplify that. And so this is also the encouraging stuff, because I think a lot of it comes down to what people get rewarded by. And in most organizations that don't have a strong engineering culture, everyone gets rewarded by the feature or the output that they produce. And so, the other things that you should be doing is like making sure that you make learning a sort of rewarded part of your culture. So when I go into a company or to a team where learning hasn't been a big thing, and I see somebody either trying to do like a lunch and learn session or to do a book club, I sort of amplify that message. I say, this is a really great thing, this is important. And so you as a leader can sort of explicitly focus on those elements and sort of amplify them to sort of say that this is an important thing that you want to cultivate and encourage. And then you might be able to find time to actually explicitly give people that time. So companies do things like hackathons, or Google was famous for its like 4-day a week, so that they had 1 day for personal projects. But they're the sort of concrete examples I would think of.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hi. You mentioned about using a framework like OKRs for alignment, which implied that they should not perhaps be used for other things. I was wondering whether you could enumerate where you wouldn't use OKRs or kind of things that you've seen before.
Yeah, so one of the things I've learned from systems thinking, or like theory of constraints, is the saying like, tell me how you'll measure me and I'll tell you how I behave. My pet peeve with like OKRs is coming from particularly like business people. Business people often want like a metric, and then they want to manage people by that metric. But like if I'm a developer and I'm measured by the amount of code I produce, I can write a lot of code, right? Like it may not be the most maintainable, it may not be the easiest to change in the future, but I can definitely play that metric. And so that's the big pitfall that I would see with a lot of OKRs, is that a lot of people forget that when you talk about OKRs, the first thing to talk about is this objective. What's the purpose? What's the goal? And a lot of people too much focus on the key result, right? So like, what number are we trying to touch, and how big are we going to get to that number? And so, I think key results don't always have to be a number as well. So key results can be like an initiative. So you start a project and you deliver that project, for instance, right? So that might be a key result, is that project is delivered, or from a leadership perspective, some key results that I've used in the past are, we're going to publish a growth framework, right? It's not really a metric, but it's like to help our engineers understand how they want to improve and grow. We want to be clear about where the potential growth paths are. And so publishing that would be like a maybe quarterly key result. And so that's one of the big things that I have pet peeves with OKRs, is that they're often used by management through objectives, which is management through numbers and targets, forgetting that the whole purpose of OKRs is really about the objective, right? So making sure that this objective is contributing to the greater goal, and people forget that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Pat.
Hi.
Excellent talk. Thank you for that. I have a question around processes. So how do you decide as a leader which ones we should mandate and which ones you want to give autonomy for? So for example, you want to say that these are the principles we'll follow for code reviews, and that's just good practice, good engineering culture. But let's say, should we say things like, this is how we're going to write acceptance criteria across all the 50, 60 engineering teams or so on? What is your thought on that?
Yeah, this one's a tough one. And it's one that I struggle with, still struggle with. And what I kind of think about is kind of, when I make a choice about a process, what I'm trying to think about is optimizing for the entire system. And when I think about that, that's my sort of guiding principle about if I make a process mandatory, does it improve everyone's lives across the organization by either removing uncertainty or by making something that is already a common default more explicit? And then I'm very careful about like what processes that we implement. So at N26, for instance, I came in and we had TypeScript backend, Java backend, Scala backend, I think one more. But the team had kind of defaulted to a thing of like, we don't want another programming language because we just can't maintain another service, given that we are all mostly sort of Java programmers, right? And from that side, it was like easy enough to say, okay, we're not adding another language into the mix until maybe we remove a mix or until we get a little bit larger, because the sort of operational complexity just became too much. And so for that, it was like easy because I was able to say, okay, this is a pain point for most of the team, and it seems to be the general consensus. So all I'm doing is really making the sort of default sentiment more official. So I'm not coming in and saying, okay, you have to use .NET because that's my preference. So I'm sort of looking at the pain threshold and trying to optimize for the entire system. And the way that I'd be doing that is really by just talking to teams. So I'd be looking at like, is this a pain point only for this team? Or is it a pain point for this team and that team and for every other team? And then I'd be looking at where that sort of common pain point is across those teams to think about, okay, there's maybe misclarity about how we do pull requests across teams. And so that means that where there's misclarity, there's a chance for improving that process. And so that's where I'd be like listening for. So that's kind of my general process.
Cool. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello.
Hi.
I'd like to ask questions from those of us who work in B2B setups, where some of the traps you mentioned are these straight-out requirements of our customers. Have you got any hints, tricks, tips, how to sell that technical culture to our non-technical partners?
Ooh, yeah, this one's a hard one. So when you're in a B2B, you're further away from the end-to-end customer. But even in a B2B place, I think you can still get access to customers, because even in your portfolio, you probably have a trusted partner who then maybe give you access to customers. But the thing that I see with a lot of platform companies or B2B companies is that they either have an internal team that is sort of producing sort of the B2C side, and then they have access to the customer. So you can either do it through proxy, through another partner, and get access to their customers, or you can sort of create it internally with a team your own. So that would be my advice.
Okay, thank you.
Great, thank you.